You're listening to Market Champions, a podcast on navigating the financial markets. Here's your host, Srivatsan Prakash.
This episode of Market Champions is brought to you by Simplify ETFs. For more information, visit simplify.us. No simplified funds will be discussed during this podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. I just wanted to remind you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Really helps the page grow, really helps the podcast grow. Thank you so much for your support. And now on to the interview.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. Today I've got Julie Kane and Rick Rikoski. And Julie is the CEO and managing partner at Democracy Investments. Rick is the Chief Economist and also partner at Democracy Investments. Rick and Julie, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you both on.
Thanks for having us, Sri.
Fantastic. So, Julie, let's start with you. So, I wanted to start off by talking a bit about, your background. You've got over 20 years in financial services, financial markets, etc. So, I wanted to start off by talking a bit about, how you got into finance. And, you were initially as part of the Navy, and then eventually, you found your way to finance. So, could you give us a bit about, your background, your journey, how you got to running Democracy Investments?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So, yes, I started my career as a helicopter pilot in the Navy. I was stationed in the Philippines, did combat search and rescue training, and pulled Navy SEALs out of the jungle. And I was in right after Desert Storm, and they had too many pilots, so there was an opportunity to take an honorable discharge, which I did, and I was recruited out of the Navy by SEI Investments. And at the time, SEI was a big mutual fund company, and that was my intro to finance way back when. And fast forward, our Democracy International Fund actually sits on SEI's platform. So in some ways, I've gone full circle. And two of our relationship managers are former Navy, so that's been fun as well. So after SEI, I did grad school at UCLA. Did some management consulting. Then I was at Autodesk Ventures, where I met our chief investment officer.
Mm-hmm.
We both went into financial services for a long haul. I was recruited to Wells Fargo's private bank, and then Schwab Advisor Services. I worked with all the RIAs who custody on Schwab's platform. Then back to Wells Fargo, but had been getting more and more anxious about the state of the world and the trends I was seeing in the decline of democracy, and how the large all-world ex-US indices were getting pressured to allocate more and more and more to authoritarian states over the years. So Chris, our chief investment officer, and I had been brainstorming, and then I was introduced to Rick through common connections from the service, actually. And we were brainstorming during COVID, and Rick had been modeling coronavirus death rates using the Economist Democracy Index, which was right on his desk during our brainstorm. And it was Rick's idea to use that as a very neutral and systematic method to reweight an all-world ex-US portfolio towards democracies and away from authoritarian states. And The Economist has been tracking country democracy scores since 2006 with 60 different indicators, so it's incredibly robust. The themes include electoral process, functioning of government, political participation, and civil liberties. So we were, once we secured a license to use that data, we have an exclusive license for financial products globally. Then we set off to start our launch of our ETF. So we are now just over 18 months old. Our fund, ticker symbol DMCY, is on the New York Stock Exchange. And when we launched a year and a half ago, that was before everything that's happened. So before the war in Ukraine, before everything with news we're seeing in China. So we're looking into diving into all of that with you later on here. But that's been the journey, and we're excited to be here.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it's very, very cool. And I think the product that Democracy Investments provides in terms of a solution which focuses on the state of democracy across countries in the world which is not necessarily taken into account by a lot of, say, the ex-US or the international equity ETFs, etc. I think, focusing on that is very important. And I think and I think it's very cool that you guys are able to do that. Rick, I saw that, you say your background is more in, say, marine robotics, maritime economics, ocean engineering, etc. So, you got a PhD, which is a little more unusual. So, you got a PhD in marine robotics from MIT. Could you talk about, how you went from there to, to where you are today?
Well, I started off back in the 90s and I decided I wanted to go into marine robotics, and there wasn't really a path, really. So I majored in mechanical engineering as well as economics as an undergrad, and I figured I'd take one of two paths. Either I would go get a PhD in finance and pay for my own deep sea exploration, which is what Stockton Rush basically did, the guy who's diving on the Titanic right now, or I'd try to actually bushwhack my way through and get into marine robotics. So I managed to pull off the second one, and I got the world's first PhD in marine robotics. Did that. I worked for the Navy for a few years, spun a company out of there. So that's my background. I do run a marine robotics company by day. But then I had this sort of awareness of the state of the world and how authoritarianism really is rising, and it's rising rapidly, and that's for a variety of reasons. And partially it's demographic, right? If you look at the world today, it's in no way resembles the world of 1991, right? Nigeria just passed Brazil to become the world's 6th largest country, right? The only strong democracy in the top 10 nations by population is the US, right? In the top 20, you have the two Axis powers, Japan and Germany, and that's pretty much it, right? So you see this, and you see these rising authoritarian states like China that are heavily fueled by our own investment, right? So I was watching this, and I understood the basics of being a CEO, which, if you've got a publicly traded company and you've got a high PE ratio, you sell shares, and you take the money and you go buy some cheap profits, and your shareholders do well. If you've got a low PE ratio, you buy back your stock and your shareholders do well. And that logic applies to countries. If you've got a country with a high PE ratio, you can sell shares and of the companies that you have and go out and buy cheap profits, and your economy is growing. If you've got a low PE ratio, your investors do okay, but your economy doesn't grow. What does that mean? It means we don't want the authoritarian states to have high PE ratios, because if they do, they're going to grow faster than the democracies. And our investment patterns determine those PE ratios of countries. And so our idea with democracy investments is to focus on shifting capital flows so the democracies simply grow faster. Shareholders should still be rewarded, but I think it leaves the world on a better trajectory.
And when you say PE ratio of a country, is you referring to the average PE ratio of that country?
Yeah, of their stock market in general.
Got it. Yeah. I think that's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about next. So, Julie, so I think Rick sort of gave a bit about how you guys think about capital flows to authoritarian versus democratic countries. Could you talk a bit about, one, where the idea for democracy investments came from, and two, how you guys actually use the democracy index to think about to think about the weightings of different countries within that portfolio?
Yeah, so we decided with our first product that we wanted to do a very simple strategy where we are neutrally tilting using those scores. So we leave every country in. So it's mostly developed markets, some emerging markets, large cap, mid cap. And what we do is we look at the 2,800 international equity stocks in the index. We look at each security's country of risk, and then as assigned by Bloomberg or Icon, and then we assign the country score to that country of risk in order to very neutrally reweight the portfolio. So China, for example, is downweighted by 70% because of their score. And then we overweight in countries like Japan, Canada does very well, the UK does very well, Australia, Taiwan, Switzerland, etc. So that's our process. We don't screen anyone out, because if we did, then they wouldn't be incented to improve their democracy score to get more capital as we get larger. So it's Rick likes to call it a deterrence theory that we've built to incentivize democracy.
Got it. Yeah, and to what extent, or to what, sort of what level, in terms of, say, a dollar amount, do capital flows matter for, a lot of these large countries? Because, for example, for China, in order for China's sort of system to change, or for China's economy to slow down, if you think about the capital flows that would have to, say, decline, would the number not have to be, a lot, to put it bluntly?
If we got to be about the size of one of the, like the Vanguard All World XUS fund,
Mhm.
that would pull roughly 1 month's net capital inflow back out of China. Right. So the amount of money that's flowed into these countries as a consequence of index funds is actually quite substantial. I think that you can have an impact. I think that if investors, on a larger scale, engage in similar behaviors, I think that there's enough leverage to really, truly make countries reconsider their policies. The democracy index has essentially 60 factors that go into calculating the composite score, and you can see why a country gets the score that it does, and they can see exactly what they need to do to improve. For instance, North Korea does not get a 0. North Korea does not get a 0 because they have a good literacy rate, and they have more than 10% women in government. And Kim Jong-un should know that if he gets to 20% women in government, they'll get a higher score, right? Which I think he would be very willing to do. And they don't have any publicly traded stocks, but if they did, we would give them more money after they got to 20% women in government. So for a lot of countries, there are a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of factors which improve the quality of the state and better lay the foundation for a democracy without authoritarians fully giving up power. But even moving in that direction is a positive.
Got it. So essentially what you're saying is, so North Korea being North Korea, so if they want more capital flows, if they if they do X, they will get more capital flows, and so that is sort of an incentive, and obviously that X to it to be something that makes them more of a democracy, and so they're sort of incentivized to do X so that they're able to get more capital flows in.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. And we know one more thing. So when it comes to the capital flows to, say, countries like China or Russia, etc., what is the primary way capital actually gets in and out? So is it primarily through ETFs, like, say, like the Vanguard Total, or sorry, the Vanguard International Equity ETF, or the XUS ETF, etc., or is it more through, companies actually physically bringing in capital so that they can do business?
It's probably more the bond market ultimately, really, than stocks. But yeah, I'm not sure of the exact ratios.
Okay. And I was just curious about that. And Rick, so one of the things that we were discussing sort of at the start of the podcast was this idea around what Xi Jinping is doing. So if you're for people following along with people following along with what's going on in China, so the CCP is having their Politburo meeting, and Xi is attempting to be is attempting to appoint himself president for life. So, just from that standpoint, one, what is your perspective on what's going on? And how are you thinking about China? Because I think China's become one of is literally the top 2 economy in the world after the United States, but also on top of that, I think, capital flows to and from China, one, as much as the government is trying to clamp down on them, I think those are very important to watch and to focus on. So just from that standpoint, what is your perspective on what's going on in China? And Julie, always feel free to hop in.
Yeah, China is a very long, complicated story, right? You start off with Kissinger's theory, essentially that the number one and number two powers are always at odds globally and regionally. You go back to the Cold War, the Soviet Union was number one in Asia, China was number two, and the US and the Soviet Union were one and two globally. That meant that it made a lot of sense for the US and China to partner. So Nixon goes to China. And we essentially spent 40 years helping the Chinese build up their economy after that. And they've seen outsized growth that's considerably better than the rest of the authoritarians, in no small way because we helped them a lot. They also moved away from truly a centrally planned economy. A lot of people have forgotten this, but China actually invaded Vietnam after we left Vietnam in the late 70s. And the Vietnamese beat them. And China was like, how did we just lose to Vietnam? And they realized that they needed to fundamentally reform what they were doing. So they told their military, stand down for 15 years. We're going to build our economy, reform our economy so it can support a bigger military. And 15 years later, they boosted military spending. And so they saw that they needed to have these market-based reforms. Xi suddenly is coming in, or he's not coming in, he's been there for a while, but he is more hostile to the free market economy. You saw what he did with Jack Ma. And he wants to go back towards central planning. And a lot of people have forgotten what happens under central planning and what these communist economies really looked like. Essentially, if you lived in one of these communist economies back in the day, you got a salary. You had the flexibility to go out and buy what you wanted to buy as a consumer. Good luck finding it, because the production side was planned. And so if you look at your classic supply and demand curves, you weren't producing at the intersection point of supply and demand. It was off center. And there's this little triangle they talk about in economics called deadweight loss. Mm-hmm. And the deadweight loss lasted for about 15 minutes until somebody else figured out, hey, I could be producing that. But that was illegal. And so essentially, they had turned being an entrepreneur into an illegal activity, and the black market was born. And so you found that in the Soviet Union and China, the black market flourished. People would work extra shifts in factories off the books. Factories that couldn't meet their production schedules or production milestones and get bonuses for their workers, they would take some money from the workers' bonus pool and pay that to the apparatchiks to look the other way. Or maybe they'd take some of that money and go buy material on the black market so they could meet their production goals. And year after year after year, this marched on, and the black market was more dynamic and responsive than the planned economy. And these countries became more and more corrupt, and the mafia grew. And if you look today, so many of these, formerly communist countries evolved into mafia states. It's a really negative outcome. It's not true of all of them, right? Like you look at the Baltics, they couldn't wait to join the West. Mm-hmm. But Russia, very much a mafia state. China is a little bit better controlled in some ways, maybe not. But if Xi Jinping's really going to go back to a centrally planned economy and you're an investor, you have to ask yourself, is this really a good idea for me? Because that's going to lead to corruption, and it's going to lead to all the ills that we've seen in the past. And this might be the end of the China miracle.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that yesterday the stocks in Hong Kong reached their lowest point since the 2008 global financial crisis. And the yuan was at a 14-year low. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing all this disruption, and the market cap index, back to the market cap indices, they don't account for geopolitical risk that we're talking about here. Speaking of Jack Ma, what if Elon Musk disappeared without explanation for 3 months? What would that do to our stock market? So the market cap indices, where they're allocating to authoritarians who can change the rules, and our governments are corrupt, they're just looking at company size. They're not taking into account democracy or geopolitical risk.
Mm-hmm. And Julie, just on that note, so this sort of discretionary, I guess more discretionary analysis that can be performed on various countries. What sort of role would that play within say, constructing an ETF? Would it be possible to, build an ETF that's focused around, say, a discretionary assessment of various countries, or just say, focusing on countries, that have democratic characteristics? And, what does the performance of democracies look like versus, more authoritarian regimes?
So we have a white paper on our website from MIT that shows over the long term, democracies do outperform authoritarian states. And in 2 issues ago in The Economist, there was an article, a new study showing satellite data, and that proved that authoritarian states are over-reporting their GDP and economic data as validated by the satellite data. So I think, and now we're starting to see quite a bit of divergence over the last year and a half, and I think there'll be more data coming.
Mm-hmm. And and also within that, within the idea of how authoritarian countries tend to misreport data. For example, we're seeing China reducing the number of indicators it produces, delaying the releases of various various economic data. Just thinking about how authoritarian regimes and how the governments control and control both, not just the number but also when the number comes out. Now, how can you make decisions as they relate to investing in these countries, because it seems almost impossible?
Agreed. And actually, interestingly, when we first came at this problem, we were trying to do a more actively managed solution. But like you said, it's so complicated, and the cost of figuring it out and who's tied to who that's why we decided let's make something super cheap, super efficient, an ETF wrapper that's tax efficient, very liquid, with a super simple process. And we're relying on the economists to decide how much a country gets in capital based on their democracy score. So we think we have a very strong partner in the Economist. They've been doing this for so long, and their methodology is quite robust. So we're using that very neutral third-party process to do our allocations. We're not deciding who gets how much. No one can convince Rick, as our chief economist, that one country should get more than the other, at least not with any of our current, and we'd have no plans to do something actively managed in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And within within that idea of how you underweight authoritarian countries and you overweight more democratic countries. So if you take a country like, say, North Korea, or say Sudan or Somalia or something that's incredibly authoritarian or incredibly, say, undemocratic, how would you, or how does the ETF think about these smaller these smaller more smaller dictatorships? Because how does is it only focused around authoritarian country ETFs that are available on the market, or how does do you actually go and invest in countries like, say, Sudan and North Korea? And if you do, how exactly do you move capital into these countries?
Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't markets in a lot of those countries.
Right.
There aren't tradable stocks. So I think every country you mentioned, we do not engage with.
Yeah.
Longer term, what you're getting at, though, is actually a really interesting problem, which is that a lot of these measures of democracy measure whether you have the administrative infrastructure to support a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you don't have it simply because you're poor. Like the moon would score a 0 on the democracy index, right? Doesn't mean that it's authoritarian, just got nothing. And so when you get outside of really the developed and the emerging markets, and you get out into the frontier markets, it's a harder problem, because I think what you need to be trying to do is to link investment to development milestones.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you probably do want to engage with them, but they've got a long ways to go because they just do not have the infrastructure. And if you look at the nature of engagement with Nigeria, there has been a lot of engagement diplomatically to keep them on a good path.
Mm-hmm.
Nigeria is absolutely a country, by the way, to watch. They are growing ferociously fast. They're number 6 in the world. They're going to pass Pakistan in a few years to be number 5. And then they'll pick off Indonesia. And by 2060 or so, they're going to pass us in population and be the 3rd largest country on Earth.
Wow. 2060.
Well, and they're not the only ones. Japan was just passed by Mexico, and Japan fell out of the top 10 countries by population. They're about to be passed by Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo isn't far behind. These African countries are rising very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And the world that we saw in 1991 that was trying to direct people towards democracy, a lot of those leadership countries, they haven't necessarily fallen in population. They just have not kept up with the rapid growth of these other states. And that is absolutely going to be a challenge. But as we do it, we do need to I think, stay in contact with these countries continuously. And I think investment in the frontier states is important, but we need to think about how we link investment and the evolution of their political system.
Yeah, while we're on this topic, do you want to speak, Rick, to your prominent democracy study?
It's a little bit different, but the prominent democracies, what it is there's a pronounced trend towards higher democracy scores as your countries get smaller. And, it's kind of weird, but if you go read Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli says it's really easy to govern a state if everyone shares language and culture, especially the leader.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's going to be hard, right? So when Donald Rumsfeld thought we'd invade Iraq and be greeted as liberators when Saddam Hussein spoke their language and we didn't, he was nuts. When Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, thinking he's going to be greeted as a liberator, when the Ukrainians, they're culturally different, and for the last 30 years, they've not been part of Russia, right? He was not greeted as a liberator. This is a fairly consistent idea. So the best scoring democracies are not the large multicultural ones. Like a country like India it's really hard to govern with that many languages and cultures. Norway and Sweden and countries like that, they have it easy. So what I did was I created a new metric, which was basically just look at the peaks. If you sort all the countries by population, start with the biggest one, go to the first peak.
Mm-hmm.
And that's your first prominent democracy. Then keep going down in population until you find a peak that's bigger than that. And you just collect those peaks. And it's a relatively small number of peaks. It's the US, US, Japan, Germany, Canada, Taiwan, Australia, Sweden, and Norway. And a couple of those countries have snuck in recently because Canada slipped down just enough to no longer shadow them. Canada slipped down a little bit in the last year. But people forget, by the way, that Canada is actually a fairly large country. It just looks small because it's next to the US in population, right? But at 40 million people, it's no slouch, and has a higher democracy score than we do. But if you look at that, the US is the 3rd largest country on Earth, and its neighborhood is China, India, Pakistan, or China, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. Right? Among those 5, you can criticize our democracy, but if you look at our neighborhood, we're doing pretty well.
Yep.
And it's interesting, Japan and then Germany, and Germany's the 19th largest country on Earth. So those are the prominent democracies, and those are the ones that I see as significantly outperforming. And the challenge is that the top 10 countries add up to something like 4.5 billion people, and there's not a lot of democracy there, and there's a real need for leadership. And unfortunately, the big countries, ourselves, Japan, Germany, they have the economic might to by themselves be influential. And then it comes down to organizations like the EU, which unfortunately has a lot of languages and cultures, right? And it's a question of, how do you guide these countries? What you look at the different nations, like India is kind of on edge right now. How is it going to break? Is it going to become more authoritarian or less? You look at Bangladesh, where and I've heard India has a similar law, but I haven't seen it. But you know, in Bangladesh, you can't vote against your political party if you're in the parliament. If you're a part of a political party, it's unconstitutional for you to vote against your own party. You know, we talk about, you know, country over party in the US. Well, that's unconstitutional in Bangladesh. So how do we guide these countries? And I think that the way we can guide them is essentially through market-based leverage. They want money, right? And we're investors. We've got the money. So use that. That's your power.
Yep. And so in a way, but historically speaking, the countries that became authoritarian and then fell, typically these countries have fallen because, the free market has decided, or, markets in general have decided that they no longer want to allocate capital to these countries. Is that typically not how it works, from a historical standpoint? If a country
Um,
starts to, for example, with say Russia, Ukraine, what ended up happening was, people were for a very long time were deciding or were believe or figured out that Russia was becoming incredibly authoritarian. It was not, a lot of these businesses were oligopolies, and they were really focused on the relationship with the government, with say Putin, and this was a dangerous place to be investing in because the rule of law was less. It may become hard to pull your money out, etc. And Russia has also historically been susceptible to devaluations and so on, and therefore the free market would decide that with all of this in check, Russia is not a place you want to be allocating to, and we saw money get pulled out really quickly as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine. So typically don't free markets really sort some of this stuff out by themselves?
uh, Eventually, probably is the right answer. Russia, okay, so post 1991, Russia was totally chaotic, right? The Magnitsky Act was because Bill Browder went in there. He was an early investor. They weren't happy about him making all this money. They killed his
Mhm.
lawyer. Um, and there were some reforms. Uh, and then Putin gets into power and he basically stopped the mafia wars. Uh, Putin's genius was essentially figuring out how to run a cartel of oligarchs. And he normalized their winnings in exchange for them, stopping the violence. Uh, and then, he stepped down briefly, and Dmitry Medvedev was in office. Uh, Kind of shadowish, right? Like Putin was really the invisible hand doing everything, but still. And he really went out and did seek investment with the West. You can read about the Skolkovo group, which is a startup village outside of Moscow. They came to Silicon Valley. They were soliciting investment. They got a couple $1 billion. There was a lot of tech transfer. Right, there was a period of time, 2010-ish, when people were fairly optimistic about our relationship with Russia. Uh, and in fact, had Putin not invaded in 2014, we might still be on that path. I think that people were turned off less by what was going on internally than they were by the external aggression and ultimately our governmental sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Once sanctions started to be levied, that really crimped the investment environment.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it takes time for some of these things to play out, and I completely agree with that. Julie, on your website, you guys talk about how how one recently we've seen the rise of ESG investing, environmental social governance, and that's sort of heavily focused, at least at the moment, on on green technology, green energy, shifting away from fossil fuels into say wind and solar power, etc. So, a couple of one of the two things on that. So one, you guys point out how there should be a D added for democracy to that ESG, and so that you're able to so that people and investors focus only on investing in democracies, countries where there's rule of law, where the government actually, where the people are have a reasonable amount of freedom, etc. So, so the other thing that's interesting to point out on that front is, a lot of this ESG investing, for example, drives capital away from democracy. So if you look at where, say, cobalt production is the greatest, it's really focused around the DRC and in countries like Niger, which perform very
Yep.
poorly on the democracy index. And, I wanted to point out and one, get your thoughts on it, but also it seems very ironic because, these ESG, sort of people who seem to be doing good, they're really doing the complete opposite.
Yes, Sri, thanks for pointing that out. And so interestingly, people who like ESG like our strategy, and people who don't like ESG like our strategy, because we're completely transparent and systematic. People who like ESG say, oh, you're kind of the S and you're kind of the G internationally, but really, like you said, we're kind of a big G for government. But because we're focused and tilting towards democracies, and democracies tend to be more ESG focused, we actually scored pretty well in the ESG software, but we're not an ESG fund as it's technically defined. Interestingly, we're still in the energy sector, but the oil and gas flows out of Saudi Arabia and Russia and into Norway and Canada. So we're not taking, and then I like to point out, you could, like you said, you could be overly focused on the E. So yes, there's the cobalt, and there's also what labor is being used to create the wind farms and solar panels. You could be using forced labor from an authoritarian state in your pursuit of the E. And interestingly, Tencent and Alibaba are in the top 10 holdings of the largest international ESG funds out there.
Wow, that's crazy if you think about it, because you've got these two large Chinese companies and they're in the ESG camp, which is so it completely goes against what would it take for a lot of these ESG people to start really focusing on democracy, because the shift to ESG has and is still primarily led by shift away from fossil fuels into, say, green energy, with very little regard, as you mentioned, for how these tools for ESG, say solar panels or say mining cobalt, etc., is done.
Yep.
It's done.
Yep, exactly. So one solution would be first do your screen for democracy, and then do your ESG. So we could be an overlay, and in fact, if there's enough demand, we will look into a product like that in the future.
Yep, that makes sense. Rick, I wanted to go back to some more stuff about democracy versus authoritarianism. So one of the things that so Marco Papik published a book titled Geopolitical Alpha, and in that he's highlighted how the median voter has shifted further left compared to, say, where they were in 1990. And one of those, two of the broader themes that have continually been discussed, especially in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, was from 1990 to 2020, roughly speaking, we saw a neoliberal, more globalist type phenomena or type order that sort of ran the world. People became more open to trade. There were more free capital flows. Countries opened up, etc. And in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the risks of having supply chains within a lot of these authoritarian countries. Say, having supply chains in China, or Europe saw what happens if you put your entire energy and food dependency on Russia. Russia invades Ukraine, you sanction Russia and Iraq, and now for a very long time, Europe was facing and to an extent still is facing the prospect of a cold, hard winter. So just on that front, I wanted to ask, so are we really people tend to go ahead and highlight one, the shift of dirigisme, which is sort of the French word for additional government involvement within the economy, and as sort of a shift away from democracy and the liberal free markets. Do you think that we're actually seeing a global shift, even in countries like the US and Canada right now? If you look at, for example, the additional fiscal policy that was generated, and the larger fiscal responses that have been generated in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it's the deficit is just $1 trillion, and $1 trillion used to be a huge amount of money, at least prior to the pandemic, and is still to an extent a huge amount of money now. But governments have really turned the fiscal taps on and, have definitely shifted the structure of, say, the constitution of aggregate demand within the economy. So essentially, countries, especially even in the West, have become incredibly or increasingly dependent on government spending. And, do you see, one, this is a risk to democracy overall? And two, are you seeing this as a large trend? And if you are, what are sort of the short-term and long-term implications of this?
I don't know what to say about the spending that we're seeing today. If you look at like classical, government policy during an economic cycle, right? You're supposed to, during the recession, you spend more money, you go out and, labor is cheaper, materials are cheaper, so you replace a bridge or something. And then when there's a boom, you stop building bridges because the public sector or the private sector needs that labor, needs that material. And so you essentially raise taxes a little bit, you pay off debt during the expansion, you go into debt during the recessions. And that's classically how we view it. COVID-19 has been a natural disaster, not an economic cycle. And so the way we've thrown money around has been a little goofy, right? We had a problem where there weren't goods on shelves because the global supply chain was disrupted.
Right.
And we gave people money to go buy, we gave them more money to go bid on the shelves that were empty. And we bid up prices. Right? That's not surprising at all. And now we're in this an inflationary period and actually an expanding economy. And out here in California, we're giving people inflation relief payments. It's like, giving people more money isn't going to make inflation go away, guys. It's going to do exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about a threat to democracy, it's when elected leaders just consistently make bad decisions. That's a little scary. In terms of globalism itself, supply chains, I think that everyone's realizing that a little bit of a diversified portfolio of suppliers is a good thing. And, you talk about, when you invest overseas, you've got currency risk, right? Well, if you outsource overseas, suddenly you've got transportation risk. And I think we haven't considered how substantial that transportation risk can be. Or you've got, pandemic risk. Is China going to behave differently during a pandemic? So when we need materials, we're ready to consume them, but China's not ready to make them. And that's going to be problematic because essentially diversifying those portfolios means probably buying from groups that cost more. And that's your insurance policy. And how people evolve with that's going to be very interesting. I know that, because I run a marine robotics company day to day, just-in-time purchasing is out the window. You're buying anything you can find. And sometimes you end up with 3 times as much stuff as you need and putting it on the shelf. Sometimes your stuff isn't showing up for 6 months. And that's going to lead to this sort of inventories that lead to classical recessions. So the whole supply chain is completely messed up. And we're probably going to see this reverberating for years.
And so you think the supply chain disruptions are going to last for a while? It's not something that's going to disappear anytime soon.
It depends, but I think it's probably these things. Rarely do these sorts of phenomena simply just kind of show like an exponential rise to a close or something like that, right? That usually there's overshoots, there's reverb, there's questions of who's got excess capacity. It's a different story, but out here in California, they shut the courts down for over a year. And the courts don't have a lot of excess capacity. So if you've got a 1 year backlog all of a sudden in court cases, that's going to take years to work through. And if we want to go and close the gap on all the goods that weren't produced for a year and a half, 2 years, if you can close that gap in 6 months, you've got overcapacity.
But again, on the flip side of that, the people who, so for this, say the year and a half that say everything was shut down and you couldn't really buy stuff. People are not going to go, people are not going to go and have, say, 2 dinners, or you're not going to go and buy, say, 2 washing machines instead of 1, or like 2 TVs instead of 1, because you didn't buy something during the pandemic. So it's not how much does that matter in the light that spending patterns are not going to change as much necessarily?
It depends whether they were things that wore out or not, right? Like your tires are still going to wear out, right? So it just depends.
Mm-hmm. And so from a long run standpoint, do you think that at least in the West, we're starting to slowly see a shift to shift to definitely more authoritarian type rule, in the sense that we're seeing additional government involvement within the economy, and then on top of that we're starting to see well, we're starting to see, at least some signs of, some signs of, say, extreme political partisanship, where you pointed out how if you were a member of a political party in Bangladesh, you cannot really, you're not allowed to legally vote for another party, even if you believed in another party's ideals. And in the US, we're starting to see something, closer to that, where, if you're a Democrat, you strongly believe what, Joe Biden or what the Democrat Party believes in, everything the Republicans do is wrong. And you're seeing the other side, you're seeing the other side as well, if you're a Republican, everything that the Democrats do is, wrong or incorrect, and, you simply cannot support it. And, at least I see that dynamic even in Canada, where, conservatives support stuff, just because the liberals are against it, and conservatives are against us just because the liberals are for it. And do you think that sort of extreme partisanship, one, poses a threat to democracy, and two, is sort of a palpable trend, and sort of this rise of populism that we've seen, say, post the great financial crisis, and especially since the Trump election, is something that's here to stay?
I think that when you talk about partisanship, you have to look at the politicians and the electorate separately. In the US, we have roughly 1/3 Democrats, 1/3 independents, 1/3 Republicans. Close enough, just call it that, right? If you think of that as a bell curve, that means that the entire Republican Party is one standard deviation away from the mean, and the entire Democratic Party is one standard deviation to the left, right? And so if you look at the average Democrat who's elected, they should be nominally they should be to the left of 5/6 of the population. And the average Republican who's elected should be to the right of 5/6 of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And when those are the only people who are representing you, those two groups should be highly polarized. And in fact, when you go look at the states, we could say that a red state is 55-45 Republican and a blue state is 55-45 Democrat. What does that mean? It means 90% of their people are exactly the same. The people aren't massively polarized. It's our parties, and they're kind of becoming gerontocracies. They're extraordinarily loyalty based, and so we have these machines that are developing this political talent, which tends to be highly at odds. On top of that, we now have 30 single party states in America, and by single party state, what I mean is that the governor, both senators, a majority of the House reps, the state House, the state Senate, and their electoral college votes all go to one political party. And the presidential candidates do not campaign in those states after they get nominated. They'll go there to fundraise, but they don't go there to talk to the people. And so that's over 200 million people who are essentially left out. The Republicans take for granted the ones who they're going to win, and they ignore the ones they're going to lose, and vice versa with the Democrats. And that's really not a healthy trend. We need people, we need the Republican presidential candidate to go to California. No one's campaigned in California meaningfully in decades. No one's campaigned meaningfully in Texas or New York in decades, right? They'll go to a 3 electoral college state that's really tight, like, I'm not sure which one is, Montana on occasion. I think Obama won that one. But we're not seeing, a lot of, people don't reach across the aisle because we've constructed a political system where there aren't incentives to reach across the aisle among the broader electorate. And that is definitely, I think, problematic.
It's a mess. And that's why our fund is ex-US. We're focused on democracy abroad. So we can all agree at home, let's support democracy abroad, and then we'll figure out how to fix it at home.
Yep. Yeah, I remember we were when we were speaking off the record, Julie, last week. So
now you're putting it on the record.
Now we're putting it on the right. Exactly. And I remember you mentioning that, how US democracy is a mess, and you have it ex-US, so you can figure out democracy elsewhere, and then later, come back home. Julie, do you have any thoughts on, what the threats to democracy are, especially to these countries that are already democracies, say Canada or US, etc.?
Oh, well, we've touched on a lot of it. I worry about social media and all the disinformation through Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. That's freedom of speech. Like, when's the last time you saw like a journalist there are very few in my mind pillars of good journalism. That's why I'm a huge fan of The Economist, Financial Times, but I feel like all the media sources are taking sides, and sadly it's hard to get the truth. And then as Rick talked about, like who's running for office, around the world, who's running for office? How do we get more civic-minded people into politics that are focused on the good of the country and the good of the people? That worries me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Julie, would you, that's one of the, I think that's one of the concerns that you bring up. So on how, social media, and this idea around how social media is, in a way, has the opportunity to block free speech, as much as they're a private company, and as much as they should have the right to decide what goes on their platform and what doesn't. How do how would you think, that gets resolved, or, how would you resolve it? If they came up to you and said, if the government came up to you and said, Julie, here's the mess around social media, how would you fix it? You fix it. How would you go about fixing it?
Oh, excellent questions. Well, I think you have to hold the social media companies accountable, especially the ones headquartered in the US. There's a lot of work to be done there. How you govern, how you influence an authoritarian state? That's a great question. Well, I don't know, Rick, do you want to speak to that?
Well, if you read Che Guevara, he says that if you want to overthrow a government, what you have to do is you got to go find some inherent contradiction that the government can't solve. And then you ride that inherent contradiction to victory. You're not going to solve that problem. You're going to kill everybody who objects to it later, but you ride that to victory. And we've got, I think, a bunch of inherent contradictions that are being exploited. But we have a right to free speech, but you can't hear anybody anymore because there's so much automated disinformation coming over all the channels. That's a new problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that it's not that we can't talk, it's that we're fundamentally being drowned out. And we're not even necessarily being drowned out by other people. We're being drowned out by, computer programs that are just throwing things out there. That is arguably one of the greatest existential threats to democracy. And it's worse because now with big data, our adversaries want to drive wedges between populations in the democracies, right? And big data gives them the opportunity to do that with extraordinary precision. We're reaching a point where, if I was an evil nation state, I could identify you and somebody else and start constructing messaging to try to make you hate that other person, right? And have that fully automated and know exactly what words you like. And that's a really scary future, right? Russia and China don't have to outperform us if they can make us destroy ourselves. Putin has said that he thinks that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And I think that he believes that the breakup of the United States and the EU and NATO would be the greatest geopolitical triumph of the 21st.
100%.
And how we view each other and how we talk to each other, we need to go back to the, what made the US and Canada places that people wanted to immigrate to for a long time. And that is the tolerance that we had. And it's not tolerance saying that you have to like something. It's tolerance saying that you don't have a violent physical response to being exposed to an idea that you don't like. Whatever, they're doing their own thing. That's what's made us, good countries for a very long time. And as long as we continue to do that, I think that we're going to be fairly healthy. But this messaging stuff it's going to be tough because free speech is something which we treasure, right? And we don't want to destroy free speech. Excuse me. But this automated speech is a real problem.
Yeah, what would you do, Shri? Throw the question back at you.
It's a very difficult problem to solve because you want to keep the idea that, that government stays out of corporations, and, we have this idea that, corporations should be able to control whatever goes on their platform, and that corporation, and also, if some guy, sitting somewhere, decides to post something, say, anti-Semitic, it's not really the corporation that's saying that. If he decides to tweet something that says, all Jews are bad, then, that's not Twitter saying that, some random guy saying that. But the fact that that has a significant, or that has a huge amount of influence on whoever receives it and whoever looks at it, I think that really that definitely creates a problem. And it can go, it can become far worse than that, where you can incite violence, you can incite hatred, you can incite all sorts of things just using social media. And to an extent, it can be argued that the Jan 6 sort of riot, or sort of attempted invasion of the U.S. Capitol was definitely something that happened as a result of Twitter, as a result of social media, but it's also happened as a result of the stuff that Rick and I were discussing earlier about partisanship, where a lot of these parties are sort of put against each other, where and as Rick and you rightly pointed out, Republicans don't really care about California, Democrats don't really care about Texas. It's sort of they've just given up on the province, on the states that they know what they want, and on states that they know what they'll get. And just on that note, seeing how much opposition there is, at least within certain parts of the electorate, I think just within that framework, it becomes a very difficult problem to solve. There should be some amount of, say, content, some amount of content moderation, but also, I think removing a U.S. president, and now a former U.S. president, off of social media for his views, while still allowing, say, people while still allowing crazy Iranian leaders, etc., to be on the same social media platform. I think it's a little hypocritical, and so it becomes a very difficult. It is 100% a very difficult problem to solve. It's very messy, and I honestly do not know what the exact solution is. There's something that, there should be some amount of content moderation, but it also becomes hard because who decides what is hate speech, and that becomes that becomes a whole different issue. So
I saw an interesting statistic a while ago. This is published. You can actually find the data online. Facebook has published how many Facebook accounts they're deleting by quarter. And if I recall correctly, they were deleting 2 billion fake Facebook accounts quarterly, which is a lot greater than the birth of natural people. And they deleted something like 25 billion fake accounts. That's more than 3 times the population of the Earth. That becomes like, how do you police something like that? You can't even, you can't hire enough people to go through 25 billion fake accounts.
100%. Exactly. And that's the thing. So you can come under some sort of an anonymous username, you can make your username, KrabbyPants69, and then post something really stupid. And then, it becomes very hard to decide, who exactly is liable. And you don't really know the person behind that account either, because it's an anonymous, sort of fake name that you're using. So it becomes a very difficult problem to solve. So I personally do not know what the solution is. Rick, one more thing that I want to discuss before we wrap up the podcast was, we've sort of seen, at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we've sort of seen the U.S. Become the sole superpower. But I've been reading a lot about how Russia and China want to sort of take up or want to try and become superpowers, and to that end, the world goes from a unipolar world. So it was bipolar prior to December 25, 1991. And then in the aftermath of that, it's been a unipolar world where the US has been the sole superpower, and the US has had an incredible amount of power. The world reserve currency, oil is priced in dollars, various commodities are priced in dollars, etc. And then you have countries like Russia and China, which are also attempting to try and become a pole or a source of power. China is sort of exerting a lot of influence around African ports in Sri Lanka, various other projects within poorer nations, and lending money on sort of very on sort of terrible terms for the countries that are borrowing, and and then going ahead and seizing the port, so essentially bringing a lot of these poorer nations under Chinese influence. And you're sort of Russia also has an attempt, and as you mentioned, Putin really wants to see sort of the Soviet, if the Soviet Union was together right now, Putin would be very, very excited and very happy about that. So it's so one, do you believe in sort of this multipolar world theory? And if you do, what are sort of the long-term implications of such an order?
Well, I think that China and Russia have different fates. You go back to 1991, before the break of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had 300 million people and something like 8 times the GDP of China. Today, there's 150 million people nominally in Russia and 150 million people in the former Soviet republics. And Russia today has 1/10 the GDP of China. So that's an 80x switch in their relative power. And Russia's trajectory is downwards, China's is upwards. So I anticipate, Russia's still a military power, and really because of the WMDs. If they didn't have, Soviet era nuclear weapons, biological weapons, etc., they would be, economically, in terms of population and per capita GDP, their near peer is Mexico. Right? So Russia, I think, is going to slowly wither on the vine unless something significant changes there. China, though, is a superpower, and both militarily as well as economically. And frankly, they're going to pass the US in GDP. We've talked about in the past, oh, well, is Japan going to match us? Is Germany going to pass us? And they don't, because they don't have as many people as we have. Everyone kind of plateaus around the same per capita GDP. Well, China's got almost 4 or 5 times as many people as we have. So they're going to pass us in GDP. But the rest of the world's going to, I think, be held together because of partnerships. If you go look at Asia, there's Japan, there's the Philippines, there's Indonesia, Taiwan. They all want to have democracies. If you look at the world itself, I would argue that there are notionally 5 candidate superpowers. Only 3 of them made it: the US, Russia, and China. India, by all rights, ought to be a superpower, but suffers from the language and culture problem and really finding a way to unify itself. And the EU has a similar problem. The EU, though, economically is incredibly mighty, and when they can unify themselves behind a cause, they're very potent. So I think what we're going to see is a little bit of that, coupled with a rapidly emerging Africa, and that's going to be extraordinarily disruptive. We have not seen an African nation, I don't believe, outside of, well, Botswana is doing pretty well, but they're very small. But aside from South Africa, they've historically lagged tremendously in terms of per capita GDP. That means that we've got some, quasi-authoritarian states that are going to get more investment because people want to, produce things cheaply. But it also gives those countries an opportunity to rise. Essentially, whoever stays poor the longest ends up with the largest population, because first world countries simply grow more slowly, right? They have fewer kids. That means that the African countries that are ending up very large, once they finally go and achieve per capita GDP parity, they're going to be very, very powerful. And that's going to be a very interesting world.
Got it. Yeah. And Before we wrap up, Rick and Julie, do you guys have any closing thoughts? Anything that you want to mention? Anything you think our listeners should know, either about, say, just the general state of democracy across the world or about democracy investments?
Yeah, just I would say read your prospectus and be more aware of what you're investing in. And those large index products, you could be allocating to authoritarian states. Look under the hood and check us out at democracyinvestments.com.
Awesome. Yeah. And Rick, do you have any closing thoughts?
I would say that even though everybody thinks that democracy is down in the dumps right now, that it's still, a pretty good system. Go read the history books a little bit about how the prior authoritarians did, and keep your heads up. And don't be afraid to vote across the aisle. Go and look at your political candidates. View them as people, not as members of a party, because that's really how we do the best we can.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And on that note, Rick and Julie, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was a pleasure having the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Thanks so much for having us, Ree. It was wonderful.
Hey, thank you.